So, a tropical vacation is something that almost everyone would love and millions take part in every year. However, tourism to Caribbean islands is a somewhat newer tourist attraction, only taking off around the 1950s when air travel became more accessible to a larger group of people. Tourism to the Caribbean continues to grow each year due to year round warm climate and low prices in the Caribbean, combined with the popularity of things such as cruises growing each year. In my paper, I looked into tourism in the Caribbean and the effects it is having on the islands. So, my thesis is that tourism on Caribbean islands is unsustainable economically, environmentally, and socially. I became interested in this topic because I've always enjoyed taking cruises to the Caribbean, and on a recent trip, I stopped at an area that pretty much exists solely to cater to tourists, and there was trash on the beach, which is actually the picture on the side. You see, it's a stray dog, and then trash, which was obviously created by tourists because that's the main people using this area. Um, and I began wondering what the impacts I was having as a tourist were. As I looked deeper into this topic, I found that there were actually a lot of negative impacts that tourists are having in the Caribbean. So I've broken up the information that I found into four categories: the economic, environmental, and social impacts. And then the fourth category is some research into what can be done to prevent such large impacts on Caribbean islands in the future. So, to begin, the first economic impact was that residents aren't seeing the revenue that's being brought into the islands. So, according to a study that I found done by Arnold Maudlin, a majority of Caribbean islands rely on tourism for about 25% of their gross annual revenue. And then an additional study that I found by Gian V. Beekes, it was found that some smaller islands get as much as 55% of their revenue from tourism. So, with islands getting so much of their revenue from tourism, uh, the residents aren't actually seeing it. The World Bank Organization found that on most Caribbean islands, individuals employed in the tourist industry are only making about $5,000 each year, and a lot of islands are seeing an increase in poverty as well. So, what's happening is there's just a lot of big business owners that are owning these tourist attractions that's bringing in all the money, and the actual residents of the island, the locals, they aren't seeing it. Another issue that I found with islands relying on a lot of the revenue from tourism is that it's a very unpredictable industry, especially in the tropics. So, anything like political unrest or a natural disaster can bring tourism to a stop overnight. Earlier this year, a portion of the Bahamas was destroyed by Hurricane Dorian, which is the picture you see on this slide. The top is the before and the bottom is the after on one of the islands from this hurricane. It ended up causing about $3.4 billion in damage, including $870 million lost from the tourist industry alone. That was actually the second largest category of loss, right behind homes and other buildings. So it just goes to show how much money is really coming in from tourism, and it can be unpredictable because now these islands aren't making any money because tourists can't really visit them. So, moving forward, the environmental impacts caused by tourism is definitely the largest of the areas that I researched. First, the additional amount of people visiting islands, especially small islands, is causing an increase in solid waste pollution. The increase in waste pollution and then also additional development built to support tourism is kind of causing a snowball effect on other areas of environmental stability in the Caribbean. So, for some background on the amount of waste that's being produced, a paper written by Rita Kennedy found that a cruise ship carrying about 3,000 people generates the same amount of waste as a small city. And to put that into perspective, 11.3 million people cruised to the Caribbean in 2018. And I have this chart that I found also. This is showing the top busiest ports in 2016, and the majority of these are either in the Caribbean or ports that are out of America that sail to the Caribbean. So it just kind of puts into perspective how many people are really going and visiting these islands. And then another impact that is a result of the pollution and increased development is the destruction of sensitive ecosystems. In the picture on this slide, the one with all the green is from 1976 in Grand Cayman. It's showing the wetland areas, and it's saying that they have 5,330 acres of wetlands. The next picture with all the red is the same area, but in 2013, and the red areas are the wetlands that have been lost to development or other kinds of destruction, and it's actually a 69% loss since 1976. So, with the destruction of sensitive ecosystems such as the wetlands, a lot of animal species are also becoming threatened and even endangered. One such species is the Roatan Island agouti, that is now endangered due to its natural habitat being destroyed. And I actually did my original map on Roatan, Honduras, before I even knew about the agouti being endangered. And so, what this is a main tourist area in Honduras. It's got a cruise port on one side, an airport on the other, and the main tourist hub in the middle. The green areas are land that was developed by 2004, and then the red is additional land that's been developed by 2019. If you visit this area, you can see that it is the tourist area and then surrounded by nothing but forest and natural land. So it's situations like this where they keep developing the land to cater to tourists that are causing things such as the agouti to be endangered and sensitive ecosystems to be lost. And then lastly, the increased development is destroying things such as dunes and different grasses that help make the beaches more stable. And it's causing an instability in the beaches. And beaches in the Caribbean are becoming more at risk for beach erosion, especially with things such as tropical storms being a serious risk. So then moving into the social impacts, this is an area that doesn't really have much research done on it by other people at this point. But what I did find is that the main issue behind the social and cultural aspects of tourism to the Caribbean is the port or tourist towns. And what I mean by this is the areas that are built up much more than the rest of the island in order to cater to the tourists that are visiting it. So, for example, the picture on this slide is actually Georgetown in Grand Cayman, and it's a really popular cruise stop. And you can see that the town itself is built up a lot, and the area around it is very different looking. The rest of the island doesn't match it because tourists don't really necessarily visit the rest of the island as much as they do this main port hub. And so these areas tend to expand and push residents out, which creates a lot of discomfort for individuals living on the islands. Sometimes they lose their homes. It's part of the reason that there's an increase in poverty when they're being pushed out of their homes so that more development can happen, and sometimes they don't have anywhere to go. And then, along with this, these areas often have attractions that aren't always culturally genuine. They tend to consist of more of a made up idea of what the tropics should be instead of celebrating the culture of the actual island. So, then some possible solutions of the issues that could help reduce the tourist impact in the future that I found include following other more successful islands. For example, Bermuda has had a history of having a more successful industry of tourism. A paper that I found done by Frank Manning stated that laws are actually in place in Bermuda so that 60% of businesses are owned by Bermudians. So that the revenue is actually circulating to the people and the actual islanders are seeing the revenue and they're not having a lot of poverty and things like that. And then another solution is ecotourism. This picture is actually of St. John Island, which is known for ecotourism. They tend to avoid like large hotel chains, and they're instead known for having like a lot of camping facilities and just being a little bit more natural than other islands. And ecotourism is defined by the International Ecotourism Society as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well being of the local people, and involves interpretation and education. Its main purpose is to leave less of an impact on the environment while traveling. And then, lastly, cultural tourism is really similar to um, ecotourism. Its main purpose is to visit culturally genuine attractions when traveling so that the culture of a place can be celebrated instead of hidden behind a fake tourist attraction. So moving on to my methods, did a lot of my research through JSTOR on Rowan's online library. I mainly looked up any kind of general information pertaining to tourism all around the world, and then I did additional research to tie those general issues back into the Caribbean. I also looked at a lot of official reports, such as the wetlands information for Grand Cayman was found on their National Lake Planning Guide. Um, the official report for Hurricane Dorian is where I got information on the amount of money lost through the hurricane and things like that. And then, of course, I also did my survey, which my survey's main purpose was to see if individuals who were traveling understood that they could be having negative impacts on the places that they were visiting. And I put the two charts for two of the most important questions that I got like the most answers for. The first one was when visiting a tropical island, which would you prefer? And 68% of people said that they would prefer a resort type area. So this is going back to the cultural issues where people are going to these resort areas and they're not visiting the culturally genuine areas that are important for the social aspects of an island. And then also, how much do you believe that you traveling negatively impacts the places you're visiting? 61% of people that answered my survey said not at all, which is obviously incorrect. And then 37% said a little bit. And then only one person thought that they could affect it a lot, which just goes to show that people don't really understand the impacts that they could possibly be having as tourists. And then my results. So basically, islanders are just not seeing the revenue. There may be a lot of money coming into islands as a whole through tourism, but the actual people living on the island aren't always seeing that money and they're not always benefiting from it. Also, the environmental effects of tourism is causing a chain reaction. Something as simple as building more buildings for tourists is causing things such as the Rotan agouti to be endangered. And I think people don't always see those that chain reaction that they're having. So that's important. And then I also felt that more research needed to be done into the cultural impacts of tourism in the future. I think that it's an area that's kind of being neglected, and people aren't realizing that the culture of islands is being affected. So, in conclusion, the current tourism levels are not sustainable um, at their current rate. There are a lot of more responsible ways to travel that I think people should be made more aware of. And overall, I feel like this is a topic that's neglected but causing a large impact that people will start to see in the future.